Good afternoon. I'm Rod Cox, the Program Director at the Simons Center, which is part of the Command and General Staff College Foundation. Welcome to the inaugural Command and General Staff School and the Simons Center co-sponsored extracurricular InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series presentation. It's the Simons Center's pleasure to partner with the CGSS to bring you this professional development opportunity as part of our effort to enhance your professional development as interagency leaders. It's my pleasure to introduce two gentlemen in front of you today. Both these men have had distinguished careers, reaching the pinnacle of their chosen professions. They're expert practitioners and understand very much the critical importance of interagency cooperation. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador David Lambertson. He was a Foreign Service Area officer for over 32 years with assignments around the world in places such as Saigon, Indonesia, Paris, Tokyo, London, Canberra, Seoul, and Bangkok. In Washington, D.C., he served as the Deputy Director of Japanese Affairs, the Director of Korean Affairs, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibility for Southeast Asia. And he was the U.S. Ambassador to Thailand from the years 1991 to 1995. Ambassador Lambertson has served as a representative in North Korea for the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization from 2000 to 2005. After his retirement from the State Department, Ambassador Lambertson has been a member at the faculty at the University of Kansas, at Claremont McKenna College, and at the Command and General Staff College. He also serves on the Simons Center's advisory board. Lieutenant General Keller, Richard Keller, served in the Army for over 35 years. He had tours in Korea, Vietnam, Germany, and numerous posts here in CONUS. His culminating assignment was as the Chief of Staff, U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, Germany, where he coordinated U.S. military operations in 83 nations of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. After he retired, General Keller served as the General Manager for Cubic Applications here in Leavenworth and as a senior mentor for Command and General Staff College students. He's also participated in several of the Army's annual future planning strategy sessions, which are held up at the Army War College. General Keller is currently the Vice President of the 27 Committee, where they foster greater cooperation between the private and government sectors and promote economic development in the greater Kansas City area. He also serves on the Command and General Staff College Foundation Board of Trustees. I'll let you know today that this session is being recorded, so as you participate in the discussion and have questions, please use the microphones either in front of you on the table or there across the back of the room. It's my pleasure to introduce these gentlemen. Gentlemen, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. We flipped a coin and I lost. Could I have a show of hands? How many of you have worked in interagency slots somewhere in Washington or elsewhere in the world that is working with other agencies outside of DoD? And who has served in an embassy? Good. Got some experience in the audience. The last time I was on a panel discussing this issue, interagency cooperation, somebody said that everything you need to know to be successful in the interagency, you should have learned on the playground when you were 5 years old. Don't be a bully, don't be a pushover, say please and thank you, etc. We're going to try to go a little bit deeper than that today, but that really is an important part of the process. Our subject is, as I understood it, twofold: to talk about interagency cooperation in Washington and elsewhere, but primarily Washington, and then to discuss the workings of a country team. On the first subject, I just have a few observations. My experience is very dated, as you all know, but I think there are some truths that probably remain relevant. One of them is that the NSC system, which is composed of committees and subcommittees starting at the desk level in Washington and going all the way up to the NSC itself, the NSC in that sense being a meeting of cabinet secretaries chaired by the president. The NSC system at all of those levels works well or doesn't work very well at all, depending upon how the people involved in it get along with each other. This is true at the desk level, and it's true at the cabinet secretary level, and I think we can all think of examples of the latter. Schultz and Weinberger, for example. When there are good working relationships, when you are in a job at DOD or JCS, and you're working as part of an interagency committee or subcommittee, if you can get to know your counterparts as well as possible, have a cup of coffee with them, learn a little bit about where they're coming from, let them know where you're coming from, share your thinking. If you can do that, that committee or subcommittee is going to be able to produce a better policy product with a lot less effort than if those kinds of relationships did not exist. So that rule of the playground really does apply, I think. Secondly, there are differing organizational cultures. You've heard this. Some of you have experienced it firsthand. There are differences in the outlooks, I think, in some fundamental ways between civilians and military. And you see these displayed, I suppose, in interagency meetings. The State Department doesn't work in military-type cycles of deployment, return, re-equip, retrain, et cetera, deploy again. It's kind of a constant, an embassy never closes type of thing. And because there isn't that cyclical aspect of a career pattern, there is not in the State Department any kind of a training float, a significant number of people in training at any given time. And that's one of the important reasons why you don't see very many Foreign Service officers here at CGSC, which is a shame. I think doctrine means a lot in the military. It really doesn't exist as a concept in the State Department. I think final decisions tend to be really final in the military. They're perceived as negotiable, I think, by a lot of people in the State Department. Nothing is ever final. Deadlines are firm in the military. They're regarded as somewhat more flexible in the State Department. But despite all of those quirks and shortcomings, don't underestimate your State Department counterparts. They bring a lot to the table. They're usually good subject matter or country experts. They're fluid in their thinking. They can be quite creative. They can be very good. Don't underestimate them. As for the country team, the country team really was the original whole of government institution. And it's headed by an ambassador who is not the State Department representative in a particular country. He's the representative of the president. And he has authority over the personnel of all agencies represented in that mission, with the exception of those under the command of a regional military commander. Technically, I've heard this said, and I guess it's right, let me throw it out. There's nobody in the United States government between the level of ambassador and the president who has formal interagency authority, not COCOMs, not cabinet secretaries. Nevertheless, in real life, an ambassador encounters limitations. He doesn't write the performance evaluations of his agency heads. He may not even have much of a voice in those evaluations. He doesn't control the resources that they have. He doesn't control and may not even be aware of all of the reporting that they do. The ambassador doesn't, in other words, he doesn't command anything. And so he has to assert leadership in an informal way. An embassy is a long way from Washington, and an ambassador's formal authority won't get him very far if he neglects to work on it. A good ambassador needs to know what every agency and his mission is about, what they're trying to achieve, And they can be quite disparate. And in a large embassy, there can be, every cabinet department and a whole bunch of other entities represented around the table. The ambassador needs to be aware of what they're doing. He needs to show that he values their efforts, and he, in that way, needs to have their respect. He also needs to keep communications pretty well oiled with Washington, not just with the State Department, but also with DOD, with the NSC staff, with other cabinet departments at a fairly senior level if possible. In short, the ambassador has to demonstrate to members of his country team that he's worthy of their respect and a worthy leader of the team. Conversely, however, the ambassador does have real authority, spelled out in the letter that every ambassador gets from the president, outlining the scope of that authority. And if things begin to go off track, he can assert that authority. He can use it up to and including firing people if he has to, which fortunately is a very rare occurrence. If the ambassador has to work to gain the respect of his team, all of you as country team members need to, in turn, keep the ambassador informed of what you're doing, listen to him because he's probably a country expert worth listening to, and don't challenge his authority unless you're prepared to put your career on the line. Because even if you're even if you're under the authority of a combatant commander, you're part of that country team, and an ambassador probably could ruin your day if he decided to try to do so. I think that happens very seldom. In my experience, country teams worked very well, and I was in big ones and smaller ones. The best of them were collegial, they were informal, and they were imbued with mutual respect. I think it's obviously getting civil-military relationships right in the post-9/11 era is not an easy thing to do. I suspect it's especially difficult in a place like Africa, where the military footprint is quite significant in the context of a lot of rather small embassies. And sometimes the pieces, I am sure, just don't seem to fit together very well. So we all have to keep working on it. You all have to keep working on it. Thank you. Rich?
Thanks, Sid. Well, kind of with that as a setting, I thought, first of all, I'd say thank you for all of you that are currently active serving. Thank you for those of you that have served, and thanks to all of you that are supporting people in the service. I was forced to come into the Army when the Berlin Wall went up. Rich Keller had a teaching assistantship to Duke University to go get a PhD in sociology, and the needs of the service in the Berlin Wall changed my mind. I'm going to focus my comments on my last assignment predominantly as the Chief of Staff at European Command from 1993 through 1996. I'll give you a little feel for the setting at that time and what the events were that sort of transpired, some of the major things that we did with state during that time. And if you want to go in any direction out of all of that, why, that'll be fine. At that time, EUCOM included all of the countries of Western Europe, and then when it imploded, all of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, which kind of always belonged to Washington, but it was still the EUCOM AOR, and all of the countries in Africa except the 4 countries in the Horn. And in fact, when AFRICOM split off from EUCOM, pretty much EUCOM J5 broke off, and essentially, and some of J4 essentially went off and became AFRICOM. I'm going to state some big bottom lines up front, and they may seem gee, I know that. Or they may see, so what? But number one was the ambassador's in charge of the country. And so guys like me who had a lot of time doing military things would have to have an idea if you're going to go in a country and try and do something there. The president's representative in that country is the ambassador, and therefore everything that happens in there that is of a military nature is going to have to be part of that. So that may seem obvious, but it's true. The second thing is state and DOD do not divide the world the same way. If you put a DOD map up and a State Department map up, guess what? The world isn't divided the same. So everything from funding to coordination to interagency cooperation to regional locations in the State Department to language expertise, you name it. If you think that the DOD cookie cutter applied to the DOD EUCOM AOR, or whatever the Geographic Combatant Commander AOR. So it's worth serving on one of those staffs or wherever you're serving to figure out if you dropped a marble in Washington, in the State Department and in the DOD, where did the marble roll to? Because that lines up funding and policy and on and on and on. It goes all over the and the reason I say it, and it may be obvious, but it makes a difference. And sometimes it makes a big difference. So that's number one. Number two is things work better and are more successful when state and DOD have similar or the same goals for each country. And we may think America has all of that lined out for some ambassadors would come through EUCOM and say, I don't want anything in military done in the country I'm in. There's a dictator in charge, and until he stops being a dictator, I don't. In the meantime, us military guys may find that there's minerals and national wealth and a bunch of other things there. So there can be some differences, but my point is things work better and more successful when state and DOD have similar goals for each country. And the only way you know that is if you talk to embassies and find out about that. Find out if DOD even has a policy or a plan for particular countries or state. Number three is things work better and are more successful when geographic combatant commanders and their staffs have the same or similar country goals for countries that the ambassador for that country has. So divide the world up, and I'll tell you how we did that in EUCOM. Divide the world up, and military folks may have a certain view. Is it a maritime state? Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Is it a landlocked state? Are they ready to go to NATO if they can? Do they need potable water wells drilled by Seabees to get potable water in Albania for the only trauma hospital? So what are the goals and objectives of the geographic combatant commander and his staff, and do they mesh with the ambassador's goals for that country? Number four, things work better and more successful when GCCs and their staffs have the same goals for each country that theater component commanders have. So in our case, there was EUCOM, but then there was Army Europe, Navy Europe, Air Force Europe, MAR4 Europe, SOC Europe, and all of those people are force providers to the geographic combatant commander. I mean, they get their money to do things each year out of an Army pipeline, and yet a geographic combatant commander may want to do something in his theater. And so if the theater component commanders and the geographic combatant commanders are in sync, okay. And there's service rivalries in there, there's funding in there, there's interests in there, parochial history in there, and so on. Number five, logistics U.S. aid, humanitarian assistance, information operations, and civil affairs are frequently the most important areas of concentration and success. It may not be the comedic anything. For all of you that are in the CGSC environment and you've got an operation, a computer war game going down there, and it's got 5 phases. And phase 1 is destroy anything, the enemy and everything that would support the enemy. So they go bomb the docks, the railroads, the airports, and everything else. And as soon as the fighting's over, you have to rebuild the docks, the railroads, and everything. So many times what happens in the later phases of our operation are things that should have been considered up in phase 5. Those examples were repeated again and again in the EUCOM AOR, that many times the J4 and an embassy and the access to the interagencies through them was where we had most of our successes. And I think my last point is I think this is relevant today, because as the Army and all of the services downsize, what I see happening is something similar to what we used to call the Capstone Trace. When I was a brigade commander at Fort Carson, I had a North Carolina mech battalion that was on the trace to go to war with me in Europe. But I also then had a training affiliation with a brigade of the Cal Guard, because they were configured the same as mine, but their war fight was going to be in Korea. And if you dropped a marble in up at the top of Department of Defense and then down through the Army, every unit and every individual, Guard, Reserve, had a place they were going to go, and they were aligned against a theater fight. And now as forces are drawing down now, and I read things about the Army, they want like all the officers to have a language capability, some cultural background and so on. I'll tell you how that played a significant role in EUCOM here in a few minutes. I see what is unfolding in all of the services, but particularly the Army, which I'm most familiar with. It's being called different things, but it's a way to align the forces against where you think the vital interests are. Now I'm going to give you a little bit about the setting from actually 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, of what was going on in Europe. One, the wall came down. I said I had to come in the Army because the wall went up. My family and I were in Gießen. We loaded 2 cars, took our hammers and chisels, and I still have my fair share of the Berlin Wall, which we went and chiseled down. But if you wanted to be in an environment where a nation had just absorbed or became aware that another half of its nation was going to be joining it, and what that did, what is the U.S. going to do about this? What does the Army want to do about this? What are the various service components going to do about this? What does it mean when the Berlin Wall comes down? The Soviet Union collapsed, and they didn't belong to anybody. So the EUCOM AOR got expanded to now go to all of the countries of Eastern Europe. So if you're sitting there and they were all targeted prior to this, and now they're in your AOR, some of the countries with ambassadors, some not without ambassadors and so on. If you wanted to find a theater asking lots of questions, and therefore Washington being asked a lot of questions about what are we going to do about this, probably the most coherent guidance I got was the director of the Joint Staff called and says, don't let any of them go communist. So Europe inherited all of Eastern Europe. Russia kind of still belonged to Washington, but not always. Forced drawdown was going from 300,000 in Europe to 100,000. So you inherited all these extra countries that you were supposed to do things with, partnership for peace exercises and so on, but the wherewithal to do it in all of the services went down significantly. So what we did on the EUCOM staff, some very bright people there, not me, we put together a theater security planning system. We divided EUCOM into Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Which was first? Nah, that kind of belonged to Washington. Good question. It was Western Europe. I mean, that's where we were sitting. And that's a good question because while we owned the Middle East, most of what happened in the Middle East came out of Washington, D.C. and went directly to the Middle East. So Western Europe. Eastern Europe was second. The Middle East, kind of, we were watching it and doing a lot of things with regard to it that provided support, but most of that came right out of Washington. And finally, Africa. Whether that was right or wrong, if we had limited resources, that's the way we divided it up. And then in addition to that, which countries are most important in those? And so on the EUCOM staff, we looked at what we thought were America's vital national interests. And we sort of racked and stacked those countries, the theater security planning system. We then held conferences with ambassadors, some at EUCOM, some as ambassadors came through EUCOM and went to those countries and so on, and got in our minds what they had in their minds about the country. And sometimes we would bring in the ambassadors from Eastern Europe. Many times, as Ambassador Lambertson has said, they hadn't necessarily met together and done a bunch of things, but we then got kind of a regional focus. And most ambassadors that were going to a post, Africa or wherever, did come through Stuttgart and would spend 2 days with us there. And we would put together the military plans by country, together with the country team, and that became an ongoing dialogue in each of the 4 regions that I mentioned. Then we also aligned the theater component commanders with countries and regions. And the reason we did that is because Army Europe gets its money from the Army, but if we want to go a peacekeeping exercise in Russia, then who's going to fund that? So the Army's got to go, if the geographic combatant commander wants to do operations in his theater, it's the services that have to do the funding for that. And in some cases, it includes congressional approval. So this nifty plan that you can put together at EUCOM and the planning staff sometimes had issues that got their way into Congress. And finally, I'll mention a thing and then we'll take questions as you may wish. With the drawdown from 300,000 to 100,000 and a lot of emphasis to do partnership for peace exercises and get the countries of Eastern Europe to maybe join NATO or at least not be belligerents, we went to the U.S. Census Bureau and found out where there were high ethnic minority densities in the United States and asked that state's National Guard to become a partnership with that particular country. So here's the test question. Which states paired with Poland?
State of Chicago.
Illinois, more Poles in Chicago than in Warsaw. What you brought is 23 states signed up. We didn't do this totally for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We got maritime states in the United States to pair with those states and so on. Many of the countries thought it was the Marshall Plan Phase 2. They called it the Bridge to America. The Adjutant General of the state of Kansas or Missouri would come through and see me, we'd chat, he'd go in and visit his country team and go back out. In each ambassador's country team, a guardsman was added so that whatever the ambassador and that state and things were going to have happen in that particular country had the oversight and the approval, not of just what the military could do, but what the ambassador saw as happening there. When we prepared, incidentally, the Guard took the money out of its pocket for the first year. We then got the 4 stars testimony before Congress. and we would testify as to what the state partnership programs were and what they were doing. In some cases, Albania needed potable water for its only trauma hospital. Hadn't had water for 25 years. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were pretty close to joining NATO. I mean, they were looking at NATO STANAGs and how NATO operates and how those things work. So that's the spectrum that we were sort of focused on there. In the meantime, you had the carnage in Rwanda. We had to go down there and do some things there. That was done a lot with the incidents that used to happen to there as well. I think if they were successful there, it was because the closer you were to the ground, the greater the cooperation was. And the more it got up into the interagency and had to get funded and approved and understood, and somebody had to make a policy for it or something, it kind of fell into the domain that the ambassadors discussed here. Sometimes it was fast and sometimes not so fast. It was a great time to end my career and sort of hand back to Germany things that we were letting go there, and see all of these things that had been war-gamed so much kind of become a peaceful endeavor. Guess what the name of the guy was that we turned most of the stuff back to in Stuttgart, Germany? Lord Mayor Rommel, the son of the Desert Fox. A wonderful gentleman. In fact, when I left there, he and I went and planted a tree. I thought, this is great. I'm doing this with Lord Mayor Rommel. And he said, General Keller, could we walk down here about 3 trees? I planted a tree down there with Georgie about 10 years ago, and I think they're watering his more than mine. So we went down and observed the trees. It was a difficult, a changing, dramatic time that caused you to back up and kind of, when you were really perplexed, just do what you thought was the next right thing and tell everybody about it. So those are my opening remarks, and I think now, Rod, we're ready for any questions people might have.
I would just, as a historian, make note that some of the things that General Keller was talking about happening in the 90s might be occurring similarly today. With that, I'll take the floor as the first question, and this goes mainly to Ambassador Lambertson. As an ambassador sitting in a country, when a uniformed officer shows up, whether they're part of the country team, as your attaché staff, or as a member of a combatant commander's mission in country, what do you expect from that uniformed officer?
Well, I think you expect that he'll be aware of the overall sort of policy context, what the United States government's trying to pursue in that country, that he'll be prepared to, play well as a member of the country team, that he'll keep me informed of what he's doing, and that he'll come to think of himself as a full-fledged integral member of a larger organization called the embassy. And I think that almost always happens.
With that, we'll open it up, and I'll remind you we're recording, so please use one of the microphones nearest to you or in front of you. Please.
Sir, Captain Sheehan from Staff Group 14 Alpha. This question is actually for the ambassador. I thought it was quite interesting how you said that a doctrine is not something that you have, nothing that you can base your actions off of. What do you use to base your actions on historically, or?
We're kind of like Donald Trump. We have good instincts. There are policy exercises that we go through. There's a lot of of policy planning, and it's a process that I think is kind of looked down upon by most Foreign Service officers who'd rather be doing something else. But there is in every embassy and every regional bureau, there's a process that has to be gone through regularly to look at goals and objectives and try to relate them to budget requirements. That kind of thing is done. But I think probably the overarching doctrine is advance U.S. national interests where and however we can. And it's, I think the planning process is, much, much more intricate, much, much more integral to the daily life of staffs in the military than it is in the State Department.
Does that
No,
make you feel
we
comfortable?
muddle through.
What's your reaction to that?
I just thought it was very interesting in the aspect of how much history you have to go back into the country to find out what other policies are. I know that you have to go forth and do national strategy, but I was also wondering what personally that you figured that you had to do more research on. That's what I was interested in.
You know, initially, combatant commander staffs didn't have somebody like an ambassador on the staff. There was a political advisor, a POLAD, and there would be somebody out of the State Department, and usually they had been an ambassador in one of the countries in the AOR. And initially we just had, we had a couple of great political advisors, and fortunately some of them were very Bosnia smart, and that helped us a great deal. But if you notice, when AFRICOM stood up, they have ambassadors, an ambassador on the staff, and the interface between DOD and state has just grown more than you might suspect, because it kind of is hidden ways. It was the 3-star here that said, I will give you an Army officer to go serve in a state assignment if you will send State Department to school, students to school here at CGSC. It was the Army that asked for 23 more spaces in an embassy, in embassies to be shared around various AORs, on behalf of State Department getting more manning for locations. Certainly those had to do lots of times with military-related functions and so on, but it was a realization that there were missions that the military was performing in countries that probably could be performed better by other agencies of the United States government that were possibly better overseen by an ambassador than by somebody in the military.
Let me just add to that. There has been a lot of progress in recent years in trying to integrate civilian and military capacities around the world. General Caldwell performed a really good service in that proposal that Rich mentioned, and freeing up State Department people so they could come to places like this while an Army major filled in behind them. That was a very good idea, and I think it's working in a modest way at least. And I think in this post 9/11 world of permanent warfare, in a sense, there has had to be and there has developed a much better understanding and working relationship between our military and civilian components writ large.
One of the other
we're far
things,
ahead of where we used to be.
One of the other things we did when we inherited all of the former countries of the Soviet Union is we went to every service and found out if they had an officer that had gone to school in Europe, and we then went to those same, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, everybody that had foreign students, to see if they had any graduates from that country. The best one I can ever imagine is that the XO to General Nekhvazil in the Czech Republic, their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was an Army War College graduate. And he said, I have problems with so many officers in my country, I need to figure out how to do a drawdown. Do you have anybody in the U.S. Army that could assist us with that? We found an AG officer who had done a lot of the drawdown in Vietnam, who was a War College classmate of guess who we got assigned to the embassy in the country. And I'm serious, with a 8 by 11 or 12 yellow legal pad, they wrote down, and he said, go get this translated. So the access many times through ambassadors and the partnerships that have unfolded have a lot of lessons learned out of it about how to make things happen well. And in many cases, it was people who knew each other. When we flew into Rwanda a week after the carnage had stopped there, it stopped being a crisis and a genocide, and it became a humanitarian airlift, which the Air Force took over well. And in a table just like that, sitting right at the head, was a guy named Paul Kagame, who runs the country. And there was a little cell phone behind him, and the windows were all screened in, and there were pickup trucks full of guys with AK-47s out there. And General Shawley sat down there, and I sat down there, and General Shawley said to Paul Kagame, "Paul, how was your year at Leavenworth?" And he said, I had a great year at Leavenworth. He talked about all of the things he had done in school in Leavenworth. And I thought, what chairman of the Joint Chiefs can have so much mutual understanding and shared experience that they immediately got to demining tea plantations and water purification and preventive medicine and getting on with helping the country get back on its feet. The mill-to-mill relationships then came under ambassadors and others that took the humanitarian assistance piece of that over with. So you're already in class with people that you're going to know for the rest of your life. Some of you are also writing articles in here. Do you remember Ed Marks?
You bet.
Ed Marks is a great ambassador and regional expert in the State Department. He's written articles in here, and students like you have written things in here, and so have staff and faculty. This is put out by the Simon Center. Grab that from time to time and look at past issues and others if you're going someplace, and you may well find something in there that will be useful to you.
Next question, please. Sir. Go ahead, they'll turn it on.
Gentlemen, how you doing? My name's Captain Bill Miller, Small Group 16 Charlie. You mentioned the funding aspect of not only the embassy, but from a combatant command perspective. And as a finance guy, that's kind of important to me. So my question, specific for General Keller, sir, is what challenges from a geographic combatant command perspective would drive or determine what to POM for and how they met and achieved mission goals and objectives?
I think the answer to that was to get the component command and the EUCOM staff together. And the more we started getting SAMS graduates and finance people and other people together, the easier it was to MAR4EUR then moved to Stuttgart as well. So all of the services were able to do things that